Hey guys, today we're talking about something a little different, what could be considered the first human war. But don't expect a glorious clash of armies, epic battles, or noble warriors. No, this wasn't that kind of war. Imagine a small group of early humans, armed with little more than primitive tools, facing off against another species, Neanderthals. It wasn't about ideologies or territorial conquest. It was about survival, adaptation, and a huge misstep in what would eventually become a much darker part of our history. You probably won't survive this if you think the first war was some heroic, strategy-filled battle. It wasn't about glory. It was, in fact, a disaster. This wasn't an organized war with clear sides or a battle plan. It was more of a chaotic struggle for dominance, where early Homo sapiens fought against their closest evolutionary relatives, the Neanderthals. And frankly, it didn't go well. Humans were far from the advanced warriors we imagine today. They weren't soldiers, they were survivalists, improvising in a hostile world where every moment could mean the difference between life and death. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not share your location and local time in the comments? I love hearing from where everyone's tuning in. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. So, the first war wasn't some glorious battle over empires or resources. It was about humans fighting for space, for dominance, and for the future. And spoiler alert, it wasn't a clear victory for anyone. The Neanderthals were strong, intelligent, and adapted to the harsh environment, and early humans weren't yet the well-organized, strategic thinkers we see today. In this section, we'll set the stage for that first clash, exploring the deep-rooted reasons behind the conflict. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was about a clash of cultures, adaptations, and survival instincts in a rapidly changing world. The first war between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals wasn't anything like the battles we think of today. Early humans didn't have the kind of military organization, battle plans, or strategies we associate with modern warfare. The conflict wasn't driven by territorial expansion or the desire for power, at least not in the way we understand it. Instead, it was rooted in survival, competition, and the harsh realities of a rapidly changing world. When early Homo sapiens came into contact with Neanderthals, they weren't exactly prepared for war. Sure, humans had tools, stones, spears, and primitive weapons, but these were primarily for hunting, not for combat. Early human societies weren't structured to organize large-scale warfare. They were more focused on hunting, gathering, and maintaining a stable way of life. But as the climate changed and resources became more limited, early humans began to encounter Neanderthals more often, which likely led to clashes over food sources, shelter, and territory. Historians still argue whether these encounters were violent from the start, or if the conflict gradually escalated. Some scholars suggest that early humans and Neanderthals lived side by side for thousands of years, intermingling, trading, and even sharing resources. But there's a darker theory, that as the Neanderthal populations began to dwindle, humans might have pushed them out, using force to secure their place in the evolving ecosystem. Others believe that the two species coexisted peacefully for a while before tensions eventually escalated into violence, possibly due to competition for territory or dwindling resources. This clash between species wasn't a clear-cut battle between us and them. Neanderthals weren't the simple, primitive beings often portrayed in pop culture. They were skilled hunters, capable of creating tools, building shelters, and likely had some form of social organization. They were, in many ways, similar to early humans. But as Homo sapiens became more widespread and developed new strategies for hunting, socialization, and survival, they began to outcompete the Neanderthals. It's possible that early humans didn't see Neanderthals as enemies at first, more as competitors, or even as a kind of early rival species that threatened their survival. The problem with the First War is that it wasn't the kind of war we typically think of. It wasn't about strategy, conquest, or victory. The early human approach to war was far less organized and far more brutal. There was no cavalry, no battle tactics, just the raw struggle to survive in a world filled with predators, scarcity, and competition. When early humans fought Neanderthals, it was less of a planned battle and more about outlasting the other group. Interestingly, the lack of strategic preparation might have played a major role in why this war was such a disaster. Early humans were good at surviving, no question there. But warfare, as we know it, requires a certain level of organization, strategy, and foresight. Early humans didn't have those tools. They didn't have time to plan a well-coordinated assault. Survival itself was a day-to-day battle, and any conflict with the Neanderthals would have been more about instinct than military strategy. This makes it easy to see why the first war wasn't really a war at all, but more of a chaotic struggle for survival. Given that early humans and Neanderthals were not engaged in a formal war, the outcome was less about victory and defeat and more about who could endure the longest. The battle was about resources, about territory, and ultimately, about the survival of a species. Early humans may have won, but at what cost? Neanderthals weren't completely wiped out immediately. They may have simply been absorbed or pushed out by more adaptable Homo sapiens. This wasn't the dramatic, decisive clash we often envision when we think of ancient warfare. It was far messier, more drawn out, and far more damaging in its aftermath. The first human war, as we might call it, wasn't about grand strategies, elaborate weaponry, or even organized combat. It was more about sheer necessity and competition for resources. Early humans, when confronted with Neanderthals, weren't necessarily looking for a fight. They were trying to survive in an unforgiving world. But as the populations of both species grew and resources became scarcer, conflict was inevitable. The problem, however, was that early humans weren't prepared for the complexities of interspecies competition, and they lacked the tactical skills and organization needed for effective warfare. One of the key reasons this first war was such a disaster is the lack of preparation. Neanderthals, though not as technologically advanced as Homo sapiens, were formidable creatures. They had adapted to harsh environments, were skilled in hunting and using tools, and likely had a well-established social structure. They weren't the dumb brutes that popular culture often depicts. Early humans, while they had advantages in some areas, such as possibly better endurance or more advanced social organization, were still fairly new to the game of conflict. Their weapons, like stone-tipped spears, were excellent for hunting, but not finely tuned for a large-scale battle. They didn't yet understand the need for military tactics or the importance of strategy, and they didn't have the well-developed systems of defense that later human societies would build. This lack of preparation didn't just make them vulnerable, it made the entire conflict inefficient. Humans and Neanderthals likely engaged in sporadic, brutal skirmishes, each tribe trying to gain dominance over the other. These weren't battles fought on an open field. They were likely confrontations in caves, forests, and along hunting grounds. There was no strategic plan, no well-defined objectives. Early humans might have attacked out of necessity, driven by the need to find food, shelter, and safety, but without the proper understanding of warfare, their efforts were likely disorganized and haphazard. Historians still debate how much of the war between early humans and Neanderthals was driven by violent conflict versus cultural assimilation. Some suggest that the two species coexisted for a time, exchanging ideas, tools, and possibly even interbreeding. Others argue that the violence was more widespread and systematic, as early humans, possibly driven by competition for territory and food, pushed the Neanderthals into decline. Either way, the result was a form of conflict that wasn't really war at all. It was a series of small, isolated skirmishes that eventually led to the extinction of Neanderthals, not through decisive military action, but through a gradual absorption and displacement. In terms of actual violence, early humans probably fought in a way that resembled more of a survival struggle than a war. Think of it as a series of chaotic, uncoordinated clashes, with no real strategy behind them, more like territorial disputes among animals than organized human warfare. There was no formal strategy, no military hierarchy, and certainly no logistics to support large-scale conflict. These skirmishes may have been sporadic, often driven by immediate needs, food, space, or safety, rather than any grand ideological struggle. In a way, this lack of organization worked against early humans. The Neanderthals, despite their differences, were still formidable opponents. They may not have had the same cultural or technological advancements as Homo sapiens, but they were built for survival in a way that made them tough competitors. The war between humans and Neanderthals wasn't just about combat. It was about two species struggling for dominance in an increasingly changing world. It was a messy, inefficient battle for survival, with both sides suffering casualties. And in the end, it wasn't a single victory, but a slow, grinding process of adaptation, extinction, and assimilation. Interestingly, early humans' eventual dominance over Neanderthals might not have been due to superior tactics or weaponry. Instead, it could have been the result of sheer adaptability. Homo sapiens, as a species, were better at adjusting to the environment. They were more innovative with tools and techniques, they had a more flexible social structure, and they could cooperate on a larger scale. Neanderthals, while resilient, may have lacked the same level of social flexibility and adaptability. And it was this ability to adjust, both to environmental changes and to the challenges posed by other species, that eventually tipped the balance in favor of early humans. This first conflict wasn't about defeating Neanderthals in the traditional sense. It was a long, drawn-out series of small confrontations and environmental challenges that led to the eventual extinction of Neanderthals. Homo sapiens didn't win through battle tactics. They won because they were better at surviving and adapting to a rapidly changing world. As the conflict between early humans and Neanderthals unfolded, it became clear that the outcome wasn't determined by direct military superiority. It was largely a result of the environmental and social changes happening at the time. The end of the Ice Age marked a dramatic shift in the climate, and with it, the habitats of the animals that both species relied on for food. The disappearance of large, slow-moving game like mammoths and the emergence of new, faster animals forced both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals to adapt. But Neanderthals, despite their hunting skills, may have been less able to cope with the changing environment. The fact that early humans were more adaptable was a key factor in why this first war was such a disaster for Neanderthals. While they were excellent hunters and had developed their own set of survival strategies, they may not have been as flexible as Homo sapiens in responding to the shifts in their environment. Neanderthals were deeply tied to the Ice Age world, adapted to colder climates, hunting large animals, and living in a more stable, albeit harsh, environment. As the climate warmed and ecosystems changed, the resources they relied on became less predictable. Early humans, on the other hand, were more flexible in their approach. Homo sapiens were better at adapting their diet to the new environment, incorporating a wider range of plants and animals into their food supply, and shifting their hunting strategies to accommodate faster, smaller game. The transition from Ice Age to warmer climates wasn't just about changing the types of animals that lived in the landscape. It also had a profound impact on the availability of food. While Neanderthals had primarily relied on meat-heavy diets, Homo sapiens began to diversify, foraging more for plant-based foods and even developing the early seeds of agriculture. This ability to adapt not just in diet, but in lifestyle gave Homo sapiens an edge. They weren't just surviving, they were thriving in the new world that was emerging. Neanderthals, by comparison, were struggling to adjust. Historians still argue about how much this environmental shift impacted Neanderthals versus Homo sapiens. Some suggest that the climate change was a contributing factor to the decline of Neanderthals, while others believe that interspecies competition and conflict were more decisive. But what is clear is that the changing world played a critical role in the survival of Homo sapiens and the extinction of Neanderthals. The first war wasn't just about battle tactics. It was about adapting to a new world where the old ways of life were no longer enough. The disasters of this first war also stemmed from a lack of proper strategy and organization. Early humans, while innovative, were not yet the master strategists we imagined them to be. Their social structures were still developing, and while they had social bonds, tools, and the ability to adapt, they didn't have organized armies, military tactics, or well-developed plans of warfare. Early human conflict was probably a chaotic mix of skirmishes, driven more by immediate needs, food, space, and survival, than any grand strategy. The result? A prolonged, inefficient struggle with no clear winner at first. But in the end, early Homo sapiens weren't victorious because of better weapons or tactics. They were successful because of their ability to endure, adapt, and outlast the competition. This war, if we can even call it that, was a long and drawn-out process that didn't end in a decisive battle or moment of glory. Instead, it was a slow process of attrition. Neanderthals, unable to adapt to the changing world as quickly as Homo sapiens, began to disappear. Whether through direct conflict, competition for resources, or environmental pressures, the Neanderthals' numbers dwindled and Homo sapiens became the dominant species. This disaster didn't just mark the end of the Neanderthals, it marked the beginning of something new for humanity. The first human war, if we can call it that, wasn't about tactical brilliance or military conquest. It was about survival, adaptation, and the ability to adjust to an ever-changing world. The Neanderthals were outcompete, not by sheer force, but by the flexibility and resilience of Homo sapiens. The real victory wasn't in battle, it was in the ability to adapt and thrive in a world that was constantly shifting. And as humanity progressed, this lesson of adaptation would become even more important. As the early humans and Neanderthals clashed, the consequences of their competition extended far beyond the immediate skirmishes and territorial disputes. The struggles between the two species weren't just about survival in a harsh world. They set the stage for the social, cultural, and technological advancements that would eventually define Homo sapiens. These early confrontations, though chaotic and poorly planned, were part of a larger process that would see the rise of more organized societies as early humans began to understand the importance of cooperation and resource management. But let's not forget, early humans weren't immune to the challenges that come with war, even when it wasn't a war in the traditional sense. The toll of violence, even on a small scale, was significant. Every clash with the Neanderthals, every fight for territory or resources, took its toll. The early humans might not have had formal battle tactics, but they did have a deeply ingrained sense of survival, and it was that survival instinct that led them to develop a new understanding of how to live in this evolving world. Historians still argue over the role of conflict in the extinction of Neanderthals. Some believe that direct violence was the most important factor, early humans killing off Neanderthals in violent clashes over territory or food. Others suggest that the competition was less overtly violent, with Neanderthals gradually being outcompete by Homo sapiens in terms of resource acquisition, social organization, and adaptability. Either way, the result was the same. Homo sapiens emerged as the dominant species. But the process wasn't swift or clean, it was a gradual and often messy series of struggles. The transition to dominance wasn't just about killing the Neanderthals. It was about learning how to survive in a world that required cooperation and innovation. Early humans didn't just fight for territory. They learned to adapt to changing landscapes, to cooperate on a larger scale, and to find new ways of obtaining food and shelter. With every failure, they learned. The knowledge gained from these early interactions with Neanderthals, however violent or haphazard, laid the groundwork for the development of more complex societies in the future. But the question remains, if the first human war was really more about survival than strategy, how did early humans evolve socially and psychologically to handle the challenges of both interspecies conflict and internal cooperation? The answer lies in how they began to form larger, more organized groups. With the need for survival pushing them to cooperate more, early humans learned that working together was more effective than constant infighting or individualism. And while the struggle with Neanderthals may have set the stage for this shift, it wasn't the only factor at play. The development of social bonds, language, and early forms of governance were critical to helping Homo sapiens thrive in the long term. Social cooperation didn't just allow Homo sapiens to survive, it enabled them to flourish. Early humans learned how to establish roles within their groups, from hunters to gatherers to toolmakers, each contributing to the group's survival. The lessons learned in these early struggles, both against the Neanderthals and within their own groups, led to the development of a more organized social structure. They began to understand the importance of working together, of sharing resources, and of establishing leadership roles. While the initial wars between humans and Neanderthals may have been disastrous, they highlighted the importance of these qualities, and ultimately, they were what allowed Homo sapiens to succeed in the long term. In some ways, these early conflicts were a testing ground for the evolution of human societies. The struggle for dominance over resources forced early humans to figure out how to manage their relationships, both internally and with neighboring groups. They learned that collaboration was as essential as competition, and they began to develop the structures that would support larger, more permanent settlements. Without the lessons learned in those chaotic, unsophisticated clashes, early humans might not have had the foundation needed to create the more complex societies that followed. So, the first war wasn't a neatly organized battle between two groups vying for control. It was a messy, inefficient, and often disastrous struggle for survival, a struggle that highlighted the weaknesses in early human social and tactical organization. But from this chaos, Homo sapiens learned vital lessons in cooperation, strategy, and adaptability. And those lessons, though born out of necessity and survival, set the stage for the advanced civilizations that would come later. Now, as we look at the aftermath of the first human conflict, it's clear that the consequences extended beyond just the loss of Neanderthal populations. The first human war, though largely a chaotic mess of survival and competition, led to critical shifts in how Homo sapiens viewed themselves and their place in the world. What early humans learned through these trials didn't just affect their ability to fight. It set the stage for how they would organize themselves, structure their societies, and engage with the world around them in ways that would eventually lead to the rise of civilization. This era wasn't about formalized armies or organized wars in the way we think of them today. Instead, it was a period of sporadic, localized clashes over territory, food, and resources. These weren't large-scale battles, but small, brutal conflicts, often driven by the immediate needs of survival. In some ways, early humans were still in a phase of testing the waters of conflict. They hadn't yet developed the methods, strategies, or social structures that would allow them to organize large-scale warfare. However, the rudimentary nature of these clashes was actually foundational in pushing human society toward more sophisticated organization. Historians still argue whether these early skirmishes were truly wars or simply isolated incidents of violence between groups. Some believe these early conflicts were just part of normal human behavior, territorial disputes, disagreements over resources, or accidents that escalated into violence. Others argue that the competition with Neanderthals was more systematic, with Homo sapiens actively pushing Neanderthals out, driven by a desire for dominance. In either case, these conflicts, however fragmented and unstructured, began to shape early human social and cultural development. One of the critical ways in which these early struggles changed human behavior was in the development of more organized social structures. As early humans began to settle in larger, more permanent communities, they needed to develop systems for cooperation. When groups band together in large numbers, leadership becomes essential. In these early communities, leaders likely emerged from those who were skilled at surviving and providing for the group, whether it was through hunting, tool making, or strategizing. As humans learned to cooperate more effectively, they also learned to resolve conflicts internally without resorting to violence. Neanderthal conflict also sparked early humans' need for division of labor. The sudden shift in survival strategies forced Homo sapiens to rethink how they managed resources, from food to tools to shelter. With larger groups, specialized roles became necessary. People began to take on specific tasks: the skilled hunters, the gatherers, the healers, and the leaders. And, crucially, early humans learned that keeping resources within the group required strong internal organization. They had to keep things fair, balanced, and, above all, protected. This need for organization and leadership was also reflected in how early humans organized their living spaces. With the rise of more permanent dwellings and settlements, shelter building became more intricate, and so did the social structures within those shelters. As they grew more sedentary, humans began to establish more formal social norms and roles. Leaders or elders, those who were trusted for their knowledge or strength, became the figures people looked to for guidance. They began to define rules for the group, mediating disputes and ensuring the community's survival. These early leaders likely didn't rule with iron fists, but their ability to organize and provide leadership was crucial to the group's success. The Neanderthal struggle, while chaotic and poorly organized, gave early humans a crash course in leadership and cooperation. It wasn't the first formal war in the sense that we think of today, but it set the stage for future conflict. As Homo sapiens began to dominate, they learned from their earlier mistakes what worked, what didn't, and how important it was to maintain a stable, cooperative community. These lessons, learned from Neanderthals and other early challenges, would help shape the early stages of human civilization. But this wasn't the end of the conflict either. As humans began to master the art of survival and organization, they started to look beyond just surviving in their immediate environment. The rise of social complexity meant that humans would begin to seek out new territory, new resources, and new ways to dominate. What began as small, disorganized clashes with Neanderthals would soon transform into larger, more organized struggles that would eventually lead to the wars and conquests we think of when we hear the term war. As early humans developed better methods of survival, conflict began to shift from sporadic skirmishes to more organized and strategic engagements. The need for resource control, especially food, shelter, and territory, became increasingly important. This evolving understanding of territory and its importance to survival created new challenges for emerging human societies. With more permanent settlements and growing social structures, humans found themselves not only facing competition from within their own species, but also from other groups, and this competition would eventually lead to more complex forms of conflict. The first human war against Neanderthals wasn't the last. As Homo sapiens grew more adept at managing resources and forming alliances, they became more territorial. Settling into fixed territories, early humans realized that the land they occupied was precious and needed to be defended. As their ability to organize and cooperate improved, humans learned that battles could be avoided with the right preparation, essentially turning survival into a social and strategic endeavor. By understanding the importance of defending their land, Homo sapiens began developing the first forms of early warfare strategies, leading to increasingly organized skirmishes with rival human groups. Historians still argue whether these early conflicts were truly wars in the traditional sense. Were they organized struggles over resources or just occasional outbursts of violence? Some scholars suggest that these early territorial conflicts were less about ideological beliefs and more about pragmatic needs. As human populations began to increase and spread across different regions, competition for territory and food became more frequent, and the lack of formal organization meant that the confrontations were often chaotic, messy, and inefficient. These conflicts were not strategic battles. They were violent interactions born out of necessity. It wasn't about military conquest, but about claiming resources to ensure the survival of one's tribe or group. What made these early conflicts a disaster wasn't just the lack of formal tactics, it was the strain they placed on human communities. The emergence of warfare meant that groups began to fight not just for immediate survival, but for long-term dominance. And this shift, this new understanding of conflict, began to fracture early human society. Prior to these struggles, cooperation was key to survival. Communities worked together to gather food, build shelters, and hunt. But once the idea of competition and territory took hold, it became increasingly difficult to maintain that same level of unity. The once close-knit, cooperative groups were now pitted against each other in a way that forced humans to reconsider their social dynamics. The psychological toll of these conflicts cannot be overlooked. Imagine the anxiety and fear that would have accompanied such sporadic and unorganized warfare. Early humans, who once relied on unity for survival, now had to contend with the fear that their neighbors, or even other humans, might pose a threat. The early battles over territory were not fought on battlefields with clear leaders or well-defined tactics. Instead, they were tense, brutal engagements, fought out of instinct and desperation. The experience of war would have disrupted the fragile social bonds within these early communities. Once, the bond between tribe members was based on shared survival. Now, it had to include the uncertainty of whether that same tribe could turn into an enemy. While Neanderthals might not have been the only group that Homo sapiens fought against, they were certainly the most significant. Their conflict, though chaotic and disastrous, marked the beginning of humanity's complicated relationship with war. It wasn't the heroic clash between two mighty civilizations, but rather a struggle for basic survival, a clash between species that both sought dominance in a changing world. This fight left a lasting legacy not because of the battle itself, but because it demonstrated the need for humans to adapt socially and psychologically to the reality of conflict. It wasn't enough to simply survive. Early humans now had to deal with the concept of power, control, and what it meant to win or lose. This adaptation to conflict wasn't just about surviving. Over time, it would push early Homo sapiens to innovate. They would learn how to create weapons that were not just tools for survival, but instruments of war. They would learn how to organize and strategize, creating the first instances of what we would call military tactics. But it took centuries, thousands of years of trial and error for humans to truly grasp the art of organized conflict. The first war, chaotic and poorly planned, set the stage for a long journey of adaptation that would eventually lead to the organized armies and tactical warfare we associate with human history today. The first conflict wasn't a clean-cut victory or a decisive battle. It was a messy, drawn-out disaster, one that humans likely did not fully comprehend at the time. Neanderthals, despite their strength and resilience, could not keep up with the rapid adaptability of Homo sapiens. The humans weren't just outcompeting them in the hunt or in the fight for food. They were outcompeting them socially, developing new tools, new strategies, and new ways of organizing themselves that gave them the upper hand. In the end, this wasn't a military conquest. It was a slow, methodical process of survival, adaptation, and dominance. As we consider the aftermath of the first human conflict, it becomes clear that the consequences weren't just physical. They were psychological and cultural. The first war between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals wasn't just a violent clash. It was a turning point in how humans viewed themselves and their place in the world. This wasn't a simple territorial dispute between rival groups. It was a confrontation between two species, each fighting to ensure its own survival in a rapidly changing world. As Homo sapiens emerged as the dominant species, they didn't just outlive the Neanderthals. They began to redefine what it meant to live and thrive. One of the most profound shifts that followed the war was the way early humans began to think about social organization and cooperation. Before this conflict, survival had depended on close-knit groups, where every member played a role in securing food, shelter, and safety. The community was paramount, and cooperation was the key to survival. But as Homo sapiens learned that conflict was a part of life, especially when resources became scarcer and territories more contested. This need for unity began to change. The ability to cooperate for survival remained important, but humans also began to consider how to defend and protect their territories and resources. This shift in thinking laid the foundation for the rise of early human leadership and the first signs of social stratification. The war between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals showed that there would be times when survival meant organizing, defending resources, and asserting dominance. As humans grew more adept at using tools and weapons, they also began to create social structures that could manage conflict, maintain order, and direct resources. Leaders, warriors, and specialized craftsmen emerged as central figures in this new social framework. The role of leadership, often tied to strength, skill, or knowledge, began to take shape, reflecting the changing dynamics of survival. What's fascinating is how these early conflicts also began to shape human culture. With the necessity of defending their territory came the need for new ways to organize and structure human interactions. No longer could humans simply rely on individual strength and skill. They needed to think strategically, organize efforts, and work together with a common purpose. This is where the seeds of early warfare, tactics, and group organization were sown. It wasn't just about fighting. It was about creating systems that could maintain peace and stability after the conflict. The first wars may have been chaotic and disorganized, but they pushed early humans to develop a sense of collective responsibility, teamwork, and leadership, traits that would define human societies for centuries to come. Even though the first war between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals wasn't a formalized battle with organized strategies or clear-cut victories, the long-term impact was profound. As humans gained dominance, they began to build more permanent homes, form alliances with neighboring tribes, and create systems of governance to ensure their survival. The first human war wasn't a battle fought over land or resources alone. It was about asserting dominance in a rapidly changing world and adapting to a new reality where conflict could not be avoided. The psychological impact of this conflict also cannot be understated. Early humans had to reconcile the need for cooperation with the harsh reality that survival often meant competing for resources, territory, and power. The rise of violence, even in its most primitive form, forced early humans to confront the darker aspects of human nature. Conflict and competition became ingrained in the human experience, setting the stage for the more formalized wars that would follow in the centuries to come. However, despite the violence and destruction, the first human war had a paradoxical effect. It drove the development of human culture. While it revealed the importance of defense and dominance, it also highlighted the need for cooperation, leadership, and social organization. The first war, while disastrous in many ways, catalyzed the evolution of human societies, pushing them toward greater social cohesion, structure, and adaptability. This early conflict wasn't just about survival, it was about the development of the human spirit. The very struggle to overcome the challenges of the changing world led to the emergence of new ideas, new ways of thinking, and new forms of social organization. The legacy of the First War was not just the extinction of Neanderthals, it was the rise of Homo sapiens as a species capable of not just surviving, but thriving in a world that demanded constant change and adaptation. As the aftermath of the first human war between Homo sapiens and Neanderthals settled, the long-term effects began to reveal themselves, not just in terms of survival, but in the evolution of human culture, social structures, and psychological development. What had once been a chaotic struggle for resources and territory eventually led to the formation of more organized groups, with leadership and cooperative efforts becoming critical for thriving in a world that was constantly shifting. One of the key developments that followed this early conflict was the refinement of tools and weaponry. Homo sapiens, having faced the necessity of physical confrontation, began to adapt their survival tools to better suit the challenges of combat. Early humans weren't just designing weapons for hunting, they were designing tools for war. These weren't the simple stone-tipped spears or rudimentary clubs, they were more specialized, built for efficiency in battle. As the need for defense became apparent, humans began to understand that fighting wasn't just about brute force, it was about skill, strategy, and preparation. Historians still debate when and how this transition happened. Some argue that the shift from survival-driven tools to weapons of war occurred gradually, driven by internal pressures like competition for resources and external threats from neighboring groups or species. Others suggest that the need for weapons specifically for combat wasn't as clear until later, as human groups began to settle into more permanent locations and territorial disputes became more common. Either way, what is clear is that early Homo sapiens started to think differently about their weapons, transforming them from tools of survival to tools of defense and conflict. But the transition wasn't just about creating better weapons. It was also about the mental shift required to engage in conflict. Early humans had to learn how to engage in conflict not just for survival, but as a way to assert control. The psychological toll of conflict and competition cannot be understated. For early humans, violence wasn't something they were born into, it was something they had to learn. The first war wasn't a formalized battle with clear sides, it was a primal, instinctual struggle to ensure survival. But as time went on, humans began to understand that survival meant more than just living to see another day. It meant asserting dominance, protecting resources, and organizing groups to maintain stability. This shift in mindset had a profound effect on social structures. As Homo sapiens developed better tools and organized into larger groups, they began to realize the importance of leadership and cooperation in maintaining stability. The First War wasn't about creating a military hierarchy, but it did mark the beginning of the idea of leadership. Leaders didn't just emerge because they were the strongest, they emerged because they were able to organize, strategize, and protect their group. A tribe without leadership was vulnerable to internal conflict, external threats, and the unpredictable challenges of the natural world. With leadership came the establishment of social hierarchies. The most skilled hunters, warriors, and strategists began to rise to the top, gaining influence within the group. These early leaders were not kings or rulers in the traditional sense. They were more like tribal chieftains or respected elders who knew how to navigate the changing landscape of the world. They wielded power not through force alone, but through the ability to unite, guide, and protect their communities. This new social structure was a game changer. As early humans began to settle in more permanent areas and establish leadership roles, the need for organized defense and resource management became clear. With leadership came the necessity for more structured roles within the group. People were no longer just hunters or gatherers, they were specialists with specific duties, and each person's role was crucial to the survival of the group. This increase in specialization also meant that early humans began to develop social and economic structures that went beyond mere survival. But what's most interesting about this shift is that it wasn't a direct result of war. It wasn't the outcome of a single battle that determined human society's trajectory. It was the broader changes that came from the realization that survival depended not just on individual strength, but on the ability to work together, adapt, and lead. The First War was more than just a violent confrontation between species. It was a moment in history that forced humans to rethink their social, psychological, and cultural frameworks. As time went on, the need for organized defense, leadership, and cooperation would only grow. The First War may have been a disaster, but it laid the foundation for the development of human societies as we know them today. From small, nomadic groups fighting over territory to larger, more organized civilizations, the lessons learned in those early conflicts set the stage for the complex social, political, and military systems that would follow. The Neanderthals may have disappeared, but the struggles that led to their decline helped shape the future of human civilization. So, while the first human war may not have been the heroic, decisive battle we often imagine when we think of conflict, its impact was profound. It set the stage for how humans would engage with one another, how they would define themselves not just through survival, but through cooperation, leadership, and, yes, conflict. These early struggles were just the beginning of a long and complex history of human warfare, one that would eventually lead to the rise of civilizations, empires, and more structured forms of conflict.